charred bodies amongst the once lively city's ruins. This is basically the story that archaeologists have pieced together from years of excavations at the site of Hassanlu. Though there's no written account of the tragedy, archaeologists, digging for over 10 seasons, have collected so many artifacts, as well as examined the burned remains of the site and other evidence in such detail that a narrative like this seems quite plausible. Generally, when people abandon a place, they take anything useful or of value along with them. But for the people of Hassanlu, who had to flee both enemy soldiers and fire, such objects were left behind and ended up being preserved under the collapsed debris for millennia until they were dug up by archaeologists in the 1960s. Despite the looting and burning, the foundations of many of the city's buildings are still very much intact. There was a complex of 5 massive, multi-roomed buildings surrounding a large, stone-paved court. Approximately 1,400 to 1,500 square meters each, the buildings had large, central wooded columned halls with a large hearth or perhaps altar in the middle. The walls were lined with benches with what seems to have been a raised throne area at one end. Around these were smaller rooms that may have been used for storage. The buildings also seem to have been multi-storied, as they had stairways that led to a second floor. It's been speculated that at least one of these buildings was a palace belonging to the city's king, or at least a place where a ruling council may have met. These and other structures at Hassanlu are the first known columned buildings to have ever been discovered in Iran. Eventually, this became the characteristic building plan of the Medes and later the Persians, as can be seen at the later sites of Pasargadae and Persepolis. Such complex and massive buildings, along with the plethora of artifacts found at Hassanlu and its cemeteries, show that this was a city of great wealth, with skilled artisans, architects, and a merchant class that traded with the great polities to the west, including the kingdom of Urartu and the more powerful Neo-Assyrian Empire. It's not exactly sure what the mainstay of Hassanlu's economy was, but it's believed that it had something to do with horse breeding. Assyrian annals tell of trading with the people of western Iran, or simply raiding them for the main purpose of acquiring horses. One of the most interesting parts of Hassanlu was what seems to have been the city's main temple within the citadel. Called Burn Building 2 by the archaeologists excavating it, over 1,500 objects were uncovered from this section of the city. Temples were generally storehouses for valuable objects and offerings, and usually amongst the first places to be looted during an enemy attack. But in this case, it's likely that the temple was set on fire before it could have been looted, hence the great number of valuable artifacts still remaining within the sanctuary's burned walls. Other areas, which must have been storerooms, contained thousands of beads, ivory furniture, glazed tiles, glass, and other objects made of gold and silver. Several of the items were inscribed with the names of kings from Assyria, Babylonia, and Susa. Rather than being spoils of war, these objects were gifts and offerings to the temple, possibly from other kings and allies as a gesture of goodwill. It also makes clear that Hassanlu was part of a much larger world, which unfortunately due to its location, may have got it unintentionally caught up in the region's politics, especially between the two great regional powers of Assyria and Urartu. This then brings us to the question, who was responsible for attacking and setting Hassanlu ablaze? There are several hypotheses that have been proposed to answer this question. In the 9th century BC, Hassanlu was located at the crossroads of trade routes that meandered through the Zagros mountains. As the two largest regional powers, namely Assyria and Urartu, expanded further to the east and south, respectively, Hassanlu would have been a profitable ally or acquisition for either of them. These states, though, wouldn't have been the only players in the region. There were plenty of smaller kingdoms in nearby Anatolia, the southern Caucasus Mountains, and northern Iran that could have also had issues with the people of Hassanlu. The archaeologists who first excavated at Hassanlu believed that it was likely the Urartians who had destroyed the city. As we've seen, several objects from Assyria and Mesopotamia, presumably gifts, were found in the Citadel Temple's treasury and storerooms, and so Hassanlu may have been an Assyrian vassal, or at least on good terms with its rulers. Perhaps the Urartians, the mortal enemies of Assyria, may have sought to punish Hassanlu for its Assyrian ties. Or perhaps Hassanlu had once belonged to Urartu and were being punished for rebelling or switching sides. Or the Urartians could have simply been expanding southward, and Hassanlu was in their way. Evidence of a later Urartian fortress has been found at Hassanlu, which lends support to this idea. The type of weaponry used also seems to come from the north, especially several spiked mace heads that are uncharacteristic of the locally made weapons found at Hassanlu. It should be noted, though, that Urartian soldiers weren't the only ones who used such weapons. There were other peoples of the South Caucasus who could have also ventured south to wealthy Hassanlu simply to loot the city of its treasures. The reverse, though, could also have been true. Maybe the Assyrians had come to punish Hassanlu due to it being an Urartian ally. After all, the level of brutality that the Assyrian army often employed to deal with its enemies, especially rebels, is well known and seems to at least match that of what occurred at Hassanlu. However, the evidence on this is shaky, and with the exception of Assyrian-style pointy helmets, which could have really belonged to anyone, there's no material evidence that the Assyrians were indeed responsible. But they could have had local allies to do the job for them. Though archaeologists are constantly re-evaluating many of the artifacts and their hypotheses based upon them, no smoking gun as to who the perpetrators were has ever been found. In 1947, a shepherd in the Zagros mountains of Iran claimed to have discovered a bronze casket filled with objects made of pure gold, silver, bronze, ivory, and clay below the ruins of the ancient citadel of Ziwiye. However, these objects weren't of just one civilization, but several. There were artifacts that were clearly Assyrian, Urartian, Scythian, and perhaps even Median. The style of the others was less clear, but they may have been manufactured locally. Clear to the archaeologists, though, were that these were some of the finest Iron Age artifacts ever to have been discovered in Iran. Collectively known as the Z Horde, many of them were quickly put on the antiquities market and sold to museums and private collectors. There were problems, though, with the so-called Horde and whether or not the objects even came from Ziwiye. In 1964, an expedition led by the University of Pennsylvania uncovered a staircase belonging to the ruins of Ziwiye's citadel, and though bits of pottery were discovered, nothing remotely similar to the objects of the so-called Ziwiye Horde were ever found. Later excavations in the 1970s in other parts of the citadel yielded virtually the same result. And so, whether or not the items actually came from Ziwiye, and to who they may have actually belonged to, remain a mystery. In the center of the Zagros Mountains in western Iran is the area today known as Lorestan. Here, thousands of ancient bronze tools, weapons, utensils, votive objects, and ornaments were discovered during the first half of the 19th century. Though supposedly coming from the mountains of Lorestan, in truth, nobody really knew where these objects came from because most of them had been gathered from various ancient cemeteries that were never documented. The artifacts simply appeared on the antiquities market. As Western demand for these seemingly priceless objects grew, some locals even crafted their own and sold them off as ancient relics to unsuspecting Western archaeologists and museums. Serious excavations of the region commenced in 1938, when archaeologist Erich Schmidt led excavations around the site of Sur Qudum in Lorestan. A few decades later, in the mid-1960s, the Belgian Archaeological mission in Iran resumed digging at Surkhdum, spending 15 seasons there until 1978. Along with the multi-roomed building complex, believed to have been some sort of temple sanctuary, over 1,850 bronze and terracotta artifacts of a relatively unknown artistic style were discovered. Along with figurines in the shapes of humans and animals, there were also those believed to have been depictions of deities, demons, and other supernatural figures. Similar objects were also found in nearby graves. Most of them seem to date to the 8th or 7th century BC, but several are from a few centuries earlier. Though many thousands of mainly bronze objects have now been discovered throughout Lorestan, they unfortunately provide very limited information about the people who created them. The abundance of such objects, though, is evidence that their owners came from a wealthy society that was both seemingly militaristic but also very spiritual. Did the earliest objects from this region belong to the Lulubu, the Gutians, the Kassites, or some other unknown people and their descendants? And what exactly happened to them? And what about the more recent ones? Were they some sort of Proto-Median group or other Indo-Iranian group that we don't know of? Archaeology is definitely not an exact science. What we do know, without doubt, is that by the 6th century BC, people speaking Indo-European languages were present in the region, and probably by then made up the majority of the population. The most famous of these, of course, were the Medes and the Persians. After the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the Medes took up the mantle of leadership in the Zagros Mountains and beyond to found an extensive empire of their own that basically occupied all of the areas that we went over in this program. They were of course followed by the Persians, of which we know much more about due to writings and inscriptions in Old Persian, Akkadian language texts from Babylon, Elamite administrative tablets, and Aramaic correspondence during the time that the Achaemenid dynasty ruled over western Iran and the entire Zagros